So the links between poor housing and poor health are very well documented and really quite intuitive. No one could really question the fact that if you live in poor quality housing, it's going to have an impact in your physical or your mental health. The problem comes when you're actually trying to do something about it. And so one of the issues around this, and you might say that, well, the market should govern itself, and the quality of the poor quality properties shouldn't rent, but poor quality properties do rent. If you've got an area, for instance, think of somewhere near your local town or a university, then you have an area which has both good and bad properties in it, and it's a sliding scale from up at this end where you have the luxury accommodation, and down at this end when you've got the very bottom end, the poorest provision of accommodation, and then everything in between. And the problem is the condition of the property when it's rented out is only one part of a number of factors which influence the cost of the rents, and so whereas you might have two properties side by side in an area, one of them newly refurbished and the other one some years into some years of disrepair and needs painting, etc., then the rents that the two of them are going to get are not that dissimilar. The bit that really dictates the rent are other wider factors, such as the location of the property and its proximity to things like a university campus, or to locations of high employment, and so that and prevailing general property market conditions and the levels, the price of housing and mortgages in that area are what are going to dictate the rent, not so much the physical condition and presentation of the property. So in areas where you have poorly managed tenancies, one of the things you might get is quite a high churn of tenants as they move from one property to another. You may also get problems with absentee landlords, and so this is a term to describe landlords that rent out a property but have very little engagement with the property and its running, which can lead to the property's condition deteriorating, and it can also allow more undesirable tenant types to cause problems for the neighbours that are surrounding those properties. So broadly speaking, the private rented sector is in a worse condition to other sectors of the housing market. So the best condition sector of the housing market with regards to the condition of the properties is the energy efficiency of the properties and the level of HHSRS hazards to category 1s within those properties. The private rented sector is the worst. The best is social rented sector. After a prolonged heavy public sector investment in social rented accommodation to bring it up to the Decent Home Standard in England and the Welsh Housing Quality Standard in Wales. And so the owner occupation then comes after that, and then finally the private rented sector. So there's a clear need for controls to safeguard the poorly managed tenancies, issues around absentee landlords or areas with high churn of tenants, so you end up with properties that get poorly taken care of. So you've got sort of areas with specific problems and poor property conditions and management, but also the PRS, the private rented sector, is worse than other tenancy type properties, and so there is a need to bring in extra powers to play to deal with the condition of the properties. So traditionally we've done this by a statutory enforcement action, and so this is anything from informal discussions and training of landlords all the way through to full banning orders, removing people from the industry, prosecutions through the courts, chasing rent repayment orders and management orders and the like. And so majority of the work is done on a reactive basis, so local authorities will receive complaints from tenants and then will take action as a result of that. Licensing has slightly changed this, so proactive for regulation in the form of HMO licensing, where the local authority gives license holders a license and then goes out and inspects their properties proactively before they've been notified of a problem by the tenants. And so they proactively doing things like publicity campaigns with landlords that are licensed, providing training to landlords that are licensed, and regular engagement with the licensed landlords mean that they're more proactively driving standards improvements using the same legislation, but they're rather than reactively responding to complaints. But where they do end up finding themselves on a reactive basis and the landlord's not complying, then they have the option of taking an informal approach, serving statutory notices or taking prosecutions. So the problem with using an entirely regulatory approach is that if you wanted to use an informal approach, it works very well with adequate staffing to provide that informal approach, and you can get through a lot of properties, but you're still only dealing with a percentage of the market. And if you're looking at using statutory notices and prosecution, then they're exceptionally labour intensive and very expensive, and they're not always successful in securing compliance or getting a large fine, and so there's some inherent weaknesses in just using the regulatory systems. But fundamentally, the weakness in using the regulatory approach alone is that you're only ever bringing properties up to a basic minimum legal standard, the very lowest that the law can ask for, and therefore you haven't got as much to incentivize landlords, particularly given some of the constraints are involved in rent setting, in order to push them to improve their properties beyond that basic legal minimum standard and provide some really nice quality accommodation. So, well, what's the possible way? It's a complementary use of these accreditation schemes, and then you can then have more targeted and focused approach for using your regulatory interventions.